My name is Stormy Sambor, and I'm here today to argue that the United States should not continue its military involvement in the Middle East. Over the last 19 years of continued involvement in the Middle East, the United States has seen very little increased stabilization in the region, and in fact, one could argue the exact opposite has been happening. And while we have not been seeing any domestic improvements, it has been coming at a great cost to the United States. Currently, it has cost nearly $2.2 trillion, and there is still more money being put out, not to mention that even if the war were to end today and that $2.2 trillion became like the final number for wartime spending, we still have veteran costs, we still have medical care, we still have other things to take care of, and we have to rebuild the armaments that have been used in this war thus far, meaning that the United States would still be putting out money years after their military involvement ceases, so the sooner the better fiscally as well. Not to mention, the current involvement in the current strife in the Middle East has led to about 200,000 civilian deaths. Many of these have come from mass bombings, drone strikes perpetrated by the United States and other allied countries, on top of the civilians that have been murdered by reactionary groups like ISIS that we are fighting. At a certain point, when civilians are being killed en masse, one must take a moment to stop and think about whether or not U.S. involvement is continuing to increase the risk of these civilian deaths, and whether it is continuing to increase the destabilization and feed fuel for groups like ISIS. The United States puts a lot of our money that we put towards this in the Department of Defense, and as many audits and recent stories have come out to see, there is very little accountability in how the Department of Defense spends its money. This also means that a lot of that $2.2 trillion that we have spent very well may not be going towards what we think it was supposed to go towards, or has not been being spent in the most efficient manner, perhaps buying things at a higher price point than necessary. So by diverting a large chunk of this fund to AIDS groups and intelligence communities, as well as providing financial support for these communities, we can more directly specify how the money is spent, we can see the results very directly and make empirical evaluations whether our involvement is continuing to work or not, and then we can continue to reevaluate the situation from there, versus the amount of money we've been spending and have very little concrete proof of where that money has been going, what it has been doing, and what the results of that spent money have yielded. What we do know is there are groups like ISIS and military and reactionary militant groups that have now obtained possession of United States equipment, and so there's already evidence that our supplies and our involvement has actually allowed some increase in the power of these groups that we are claiming to combat. So by providing intelligence, financial support, and medical aid and other support to local groups, local coalitions, and local governments to combat these areas, we will be better equipped to spend less money, to increase stabilization in the region, and to allow these governments to build a region that is best fit to their interests and that could lead to cooperation with the United States versus increased hostility that could come from the increased military involvement, especially considering that once all of this resolves, there's undoubtedly going to be a good number of civilians and people who blame the United States directly for many of the deaths, many of the civilian damages, and much of the equipment that these militant groups have been using to overthrow governments and incite civil wars. Not to mention that the local coalitions will be more familiar with the terrain, so they will be better equipped to fight ISIS on that terrain, come up with backup plans, come up with routes out, and still know the ways to minimize these civilian deaths that have been increasing rapidly, especially as technology has evolved. With all of that said, the United States should not be ignoring that there is a crisis in the Middle East, and there are ways to be involved and assist in this region without that being direct military boots on the ground force, which costs us large amounts of money, doesn't necessarily bring stabilization to the region as we have shown, and will continue to cost long after our involvement has directly wrapped up. So I thank you very much for listening to me and look forward to see some of your responses. Thank you very much.